Coach Ryan Hendricks had a sacred tradition at Northwood High School in Bend, Oregon. New outsider girls got hazed until they learned their place in the school's rigid social hierarchy. For 4 years, he'd used his wrestling team to intimidate scholarship students and what he called mountain trash into either dropping out or staying silent about harassment. But when he cornered 16-year-old Piper Blackwood in the third-floor girls' restroom and ordered his wrestlers to teach the farm girls some manners, he had no idea she'd been training in Krav Maga since age 8. What happened in that restroom would be live-streamed to the entire school and destroy a decades-old culture of athletic department abuse that had operated with impunity for far too long. Every school has spaces where things happen that students never talk about until someone finds the courage to break the silence. Right now, someone reading this knows exactly what that restroom felt like, what that fear felt like, and what it means to realize you're completely alone with people who have power over your future. Those moments shape us more than any classroom lesson ever could. The morning of November 8th began like every other day at Northwood High School, with 16-year-old Piper Blackwood arriving at 7:30 a.m. in her father's old pickup truck. The engine making sounds that suggested major repairs were needed soon. She'd been at Northwood for exactly 2 months, since transferring from a tiny rural school in eastern Montana, where her family had lost their ranch to foreclosure after her father's death from cancer 2 years earlier. Piper had learned that survival in a new environment required careful observation and strategic invisibility. At 5 feet 4 inches, with honey blonde hair usually braided down her back and gray eyes that missed nothing, she wore the same rotation of thrift store clothes that marked her as definitively different from Northwood's carefully curated social ecosystem. Her jeans were clean but faded. Her boots were practical rather than fashionable, and her backpack had been patched multiple times with duct tape that her mother had tried to make less obvious. What none of her 1,700 classmates knew was that Piper Blackwood possessed a second-degree black belt in Krav Maga, earned through 8 years of training with Samuel Cohen, a former Israeli Defense Forces instructor who'd moved to rural Montana after retiring from military service. Her mother, Sarah Blackwood, had enrolled her after Piper came home from 4th grade with bruises from older boys who'd targeted the poor kid whose daddy was dying. Cohen had taught her that Krav Maga wasn't about aggression or showing off, it was about ending threats quickly and efficiently, using whatever force was necessary to neutralize danger and escape safely. Never look for trouble. Cohen had drilled into her during countless training sessions, but when trouble finds you, end it fast and get away. The goal is survival, not victory. Piper had hoped those skills would remain theoretical at Northwood High School, where she intended to keep her head down, maintain her grades, and help her mother rebuild their lives after losing everything in Montana. She'd deliberately chosen to hide her martial arts background, understanding that rural communities often viewed outsiders with skills as threatening rather than impressive. She was wrong about staying invisible. Coach Ryan Hendricks ruled Northwood's athletic department like a medieval fiefdom, where his word was law and questioning his authority resulted in swift and severe consequences. At 38, he was a former college wrestler who'd never quite achieved his dreams of Olympic competition, instead channeling his competitive drive into molding what he called real athletes at the high school level. Hendricks had been hired 6 years ago, specifically to restore discipline to Northwood, after a series of incidents involving athletes had created negative publicity for the district. The school board, dominated by former athletes and wrestling boosters, wanted someone who would return to traditional values and create the kind of tough, successful program that had characterized Northwood's golden years in the 1980s and 90s. What they'd really hired was a systematic abuser who used his position to implement a culture of hazing, intimidation, and selective enforcement that targeted anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable behavior. Hendricks' office was located in the athletic wing's most prominent position, directly across from the wrestling room, where he could observe all traffic in and out of the area. The walls were covered with photos of state championship teams, newspaper clippings about wrestling victories, and certificates recognizing his coaching achievements. Behind his desk hung a large photograph of himself in his college wrestling uniform, arms raised in victory after winning a regional championship 20 years earlier. The centerpiece of his office was a locked filing cabinet that contained what he called disciplinary documentation for students who'd received his special attention over the years. The files included photographs, detailed notes about attitude problems, and correspondence with parents who'd been convinced that their children's difficulties were the result of character flaws rather than systematic harassment. Hendricks had perfected a system of plausible deniability that protected him from serious consequences while allowing him to target students he deemed problematic. His methods included academic sabotage disguised as grade disputes, social isolation implemented through athletic team hierarchies, and physical intimidation that stopped just short of actionable assault, until Piper Blackwood transferred to Northwood and unknowingly challenged everything he'd built. Piper's first encounter with Hendricks came during her third week at school, when she'd been walking to her advanced placement chemistry class and accidentally bumped into Colton Ward, the wrestling team captain, causing him to spill coffee on his Letterman jacket. The collision was clearly accidental. Security cameras would later prove that Colton had been walking while texting and stepped directly into Piper's path, but the incident provided Hendricks with an excuse to begin his campaign against the new transfer student, Miss Blackwood. Hendricks' voice boomed across the hallway, loud enough to stop conversations and draw attention from other students. My office. Now. Piper had never spoken to the coach before, but she recognized the tone of authority that demanded immediate compliance. She gathered her books and followed him through the athletic wing, noting how other students stepped aside to let them pass and avoided making eye contact. Hendricks' office felt smaller than it actually was, dominated by his oversized presence and the weight of institutional power he represented. He gestured for Piper to sit in a chair, positioned directly in front of his desk while he remained standing. Using his 6'2" frame to create psychological pressure, Miss Blackwood, Hendricks began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating teenagers. Colton Ward is one of our most valuable student athletes. With college scouts already showing interest in his wrestling career, I understand you had an altercation with him this morning. There wasn't an altercation, Piper replied carefully. I accidentally bumped into him because I was looking at my class schedule. I apologized immediately. That's not how Colton described the incident, Hendricks said, making notes on a tablet. He indicated that you deliberately targeted him and showed disrespect when confronted about your behavior. Piper felt her stomach tighten as she realized this conversation had nothing to do with the actual collision and everything to do with establishing dominance. That's not what happened. I can show you my schedule if you want to verify that I was trying to find my classroom, Miss Blackwood, Hendricks said, his tone suggesting that questioning his version of events was itself a violation. I think you're confused about how things work at Northwood High School. Our athletes represent this institution with distinction, and they deserve respect from other students. When that respect isn't shown, there are consequences. The threat was clear, even though it was wrapped in language about school pride and athletic achievement. Piper understood that Hendricks was using Colton's complaint as an excuse to target her, possibly because her academic performance was threatening the wrestling captain's status as one of the school's top students. I respect all students at this school, Piper said carefully. I'm not here to cause problems for anyone. I just want to complete my education and help my mother rebuild our lives. Hendricks studied her for a long moment, perhaps surprised by her direct response rather than the stammering apology he'd expected. We'll see about that, he said finally. But I want you to understand that Northwood has standards, and students who don't meet those standards find their experience here becomes very challenging. As Piper left Hendricks' office, she understood that she'd made an enemy through no fault of her own. What she didn't realize was that the coach's standards were about to be tested by someone who possessed skills he couldn't imagine. Over the next month, Hendricks' campaign against Piper intensified with systematic precision that revealed years of experience in psychological warfare against students. He positioned wrestlers in hallways where she walked, creating intimidating gauntlets that forced her to navigate around groups of large, hostile athletes. He arranged for accidental disruptions during her classes, sending wrestlers to deliver messages that interrupted her participation in discussions or distracted her during exams. The harassment extended to social media, where anonymous accounts began posting memes about mountain trash and welfare transfers who didn't understand Northwood traditions. The posts were carefully crafted to avoid direct identification while making it clear they were targeted at Piper, creating a climate of mockery that affected her social standing without providing grounds for official complaints. Other students began to notice the pattern of targeting, but most were too afraid of becoming secondary targets to offer support. The wrestling team's dominance of school social hierarchies meant that associating with someone they'd marked for harassment could result in similar treatment. Amara Foster was the exception. Amara was a 15-year-old sophomore whose family had moved to Bend from Oakland, California, when her father got a job as a software engineer with a local technology company. As one of only 12 African-American students at Northwood, she'd already experienced her own version of the school's hostility toward outsiders. Though her father's professional status and her own exceptional academic abilities had provided some protection from overt harassment, Amara had been watching Hendricks' treatment of Piper with growing concern, recognizing patterns that reminded her of her own early experiences at Northwood. She'd also noticed that Piper's academic performance was exceptional despite the constant disruption, suggesting intelligence and resilience that most students her age couldn't maintain under such pressure. During lunch on a gray October afternoon, Amara made a decision that would change both of their lives. She approached Piper's isolated table in the cafeteria's far corner, where the new transfer student sat alone with a brown bag lunch that clearly came from home rather than the school's food service. "Mind if I sit here?" Amara asked, her voice carefully casual despite the attention the action would draw from other students. Piper looked up, surprised by the unexpected social contact. "Of course, I'm Piper, Amara," she replied, settling into the chair across from Piper and immediately noticing how the conversation volume in nearby tables decreased as students focused on their interaction. "I've been watching what's happening to you with Hendricks and his wrestlers. That's not normal, even for Northwood. I figured I was just the new kid getting tested," Piper said, though her tone suggested she understood the targeting was more systematic than typical teenage hazing. "This is different," Amara said quietly. "Hendricks has done this to other students over the years, but usually they transfer out or just accept being social outcasts. You're handling it differently." Piper considered this information while eating her homemade sandwich. What happened to the other students? Most left Northwood within a semester. A few stayed but basically became invisible. One girl, Jessica Martinez, tried to file complaints with the administration, but nothing happened because Hendricks documented everything as legitimate disciplinary concerns. What about evidence? Did anyone try to document what was really happening? Amara smiled slightly, recognizing that Piper was thinking strategically rather than just accepting victimization. "That's where I might be able to help. I'm pretty good with technology, and I've been thinking that someone needs to create a record of how this school really operates." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Garrett Stone, Coach Hendricks' 17-year-old nephew and a starting member of the wrestling team. Garrett had inherited his uncle's imposing physical presence and aggressive personality, though he lacked the intelligence and strategic thinking that made Hendricks truly dangerous. "Well, Look at this, Garrett announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. The welfare girl and the diversity hire found each other. How touching. The racial slur was delivered with enough plausible deniability that it could be defended as innocent commentary. But everyone within earshot understood the deliberate nature of the insult. Piper felt him muscles tense, recognizing the moment when a situation could escalate quickly. "We're just having lunch," Piper said evenly, her voice carrying no fear, despite her awareness of Garrett's size advantage. "In the wrong section," Garrett replied, stepping closer to their table. "This area is for students who actually belong at Northwood, not charity cases, who can't afford to eat real food." Amara pulled out her phone, ostensibly to check messages, but actually to begin recording the interaction. Her movement caught Garrett's attention, and his expression shifted to something more menacing. "Put that away," he ordered. "Nobody wants pictures of this conversation." "I'm not taking pictures," Amara replied calmly, though she continued recording audio. "Just checking my schedule for next period." Garrett reached across the table and grabbed Amara's phone, his action drawing gasps from nearby students who recognized that he'd crossed a line from verbal harassment to theft. As he examined the device, his face darkened when he discovered the recording application. "You were recording me," he said, his voice carrying genuine threat. "That's illegal without consent." "Actually, Oregon is a one-party consent state," Amara replied with the confidence that came from having researched the law specifically for this situation. "I can record any conversation I'm part of." Piper watched the interaction with growing tension, recognizing that Garrett's humiliation at being corrected by Amara was likely to result in escalated aggression. Her Krav Maga training had taught her to assess threat levels and prepare for violence before it became unavoidable. "Give her the phone back," Piper said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that made Garrett look at her more carefully. "Or what?" Garrett asked, stepping around the table to position himself between the girls and the nearest exit. "You'll call your mommy to complain about the mean kids at school?" That's when Piper made a mistake that would have serious consequences. Instead of de-escalating or seeking help from adults, she allowed her anger at weeks of harassment to override her training about avoiding confrontation. "Or I'll take it back myself," she said, standing up and facing Garrett directly. The challenge was exactly what Garrett had been hoping for. As the coach's nephew, he understood that any physical altercation with Piper would be interpreted in his favor by the administration. Regardless of who actually initiated contact, he'd also been instructed by his uncle to look for opportunities to provoke the transfer student into behavior that could justify more severe harassment. "I'd like to see you try," Garrett said, holding Amara's phone above his head and grinning at the size difference between himself and Piper. The confrontation had drawn attention from the entire cafeteria, with students pulling out their own phones to record what appeared to be an inevitable fight. Several teachers on lunch duty had noticed the commotion, but seemed reluctant to intervene in a situation involving one of Coach Hendrick's wrestlers. Piper realized she was facing a no-win scenario. If she backed down, Garrett would keep Amara's phone and the harassment would intensify with the knowledge that they could be physically intimidated. If she tried to retrieve the phone, any contact would be characterized as assault on her part, giving Hendricks the excuse he needed to have her suspended or expelled. That's when Miss Janet Kim arrived. Miss Kim was Northwood's newest guidance counselor, a 32-year-old Korean-American woman who'd been hired the previous year after completing her master's degree in educational psychology. Unlike most of the faculty, she hadn't been at Northwood long enough to be intimidated by the athletic department's power, and her professional training had taught her to recognize systematic harassment when she saw it. "Mr. Stone, Miss," Kim said firmly, approaching the table with the authority that came from her position as a licensed counselor. "Return Miss Foster's property immediately and report to my office." Garrett's confident expression faltered as he realized that his actions had been witnessed by an adult who wasn't afraid to challenge him. "We were just talking," he said weakly, lowering the phone but not yet returning it. "You were committing theft." "Miss," Kim replied, "give Miss Foster her phone, and we'll discuss this situation privately rather than involving campus security." The threat of official consequences caused Garrett to reluctantly hand the phone back to Amara, though his expression promised that the confrontation wasn't over. As he walked away, he made sure to bump into Piper's shoulder hard enough to cause her to stumble, a final gesture of aggression that couldn't be characterized as assault, but sent a clear message about future interactions. "Are you both all right, miss?" Kim asked once Garrett had left the cafeteria. "We're fine," Piper replied, though her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had prepared her for physical combat. "Thank you for intervening, miss." Kim studied both girls carefully, recognizing signs of systematic harassment that extended beyond the single incident she'd witnessed. "If you're experiencing ongoing problems with any students or staff, my door is always open." Sometimes, situations require adult intervention to resolve safely. As Miss Kim left, Amara turned to Piper with new respect. "You were ready to fight him, weren't you? Even though he's twice your size?" Piper nodded slowly, still processing how close she'd come to revealing her martial arts skills, in a situation that would have created far more problems than it solved. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when the odds aren't in your favor. "Next time, let's be smarter about it," Amara said, holding up her phone. "I got everything recorded, including him stealing my phone and you standing up to him. If we're going to take on Hendricks and his wrestlers, we need evidence and strategy, not just courage." That afternoon, Piper received a text message from an unknown number. "Your little stunt at lunch was cute, but you have no idea what real consequences look like. This is just the beginning." She screenshot the message and forwarded it to Amara, who added it to a digital file she'd been building to document the harassment campaign. What neither of them realized was that their confrontation with Garrett had convinced Coach Hendricks that more decisive action was needed to deal with the problem Piper represented. The next phase of his campaign would move beyond psychological intimidation into territory that would test everything Piper had learned about survival, strategy, and the courage required to fight back against institutional power that seemed untouchable. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon when most students had left campus for weekend activities, Piper received a handwritten note slipped into her locker. "Meet me in the third-floor girls' restroom at 4:15 p.m. Important information about your academic standing, Miss Kim." The note looked authentic, written on official school counseling department stationery, and signed with what appeared to be Miss Kim's signature. Piper had been expecting follow-up conversation about the cafeteria incident, so the request for a private meeting seemed reasonable. What she didn't know was that Coach Hendricks had spent years perfecting the art of forging official documents and creating situations where his targets would be isolated without witnesses or security camera coverage. The third-floor girls' restroom was located in the oldest part of the building, where surveillance equipment hadn't been updated and cellular reception was minimal. At exactly 4:15 p.m., Piper climbed the stairs to the third floor and pushed open the restroom door, expecting to find Miss Kim waiting with information about her grades or possibly advice about handling the ongoing harassment from the wrestling team. Instead, she found herself facing Coach Ryan Hendricks, flanked by 3 of his wrestlers, Colton Ward, Garrett Stone, and a senior named Marcus Briggs, whose reputation for violence had earned him respect even among other athletes. The door clicked shut behind her with a sound that suggested it had been locked from the outside. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered ominously, and Piper realized that the small window high on the far wall was the only source of natural light in a space that suddenly felt more like a trap than a meeting location. "Miss Blackwood," Coach Hendricks said, his voice carrying a tone of satisfaction that made Piper's skin crawl. "I think it's time you learned some important lessons about respect, tradition, and knowing your place at Northwood High School, Miss Blackwood," Coach Hendricks continued, stepping closer while his three wrestlers positioned themselves to block any escape routes. "You've been at Northwood for 2 months now, and you still don't seem to understand how things work here. That's going to change today." Piper's Krav Maga training kicked in immediately, her mind automatically assessing the tactical situation while her body prepared for combat. 4 opponents in a confined space. No weapons visible. Nearest exit blocked. Window too high and small for escape. Her instructor's voice echoed in her memory. When cornered by multiple attackers, eliminate the biggest threat first. Create chaos. And escape immediately. "I understand perfectly," Piper replied, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You use your position to intimidate students because you never learned how to earn respect legitimately." Hendricks' face flushed red at the direct challenge to his authority. "You have no idea who you're talking to. I've been building champions at this school for 6 years while entitled. Little girls like you think you can waltz in and disrespect our traditions." "Your traditions involve cornering teenage girls in bathrooms?" Piper asked, taking a small step backward to create more fighting room. "That's not tradition. That's predatory behavior." What none of them realized was that Amara Foster had been tracking Piper's location through a phone app they'd set up after the cafeteria incident. When Piper's phone went stationary in an unusual location for longer than 15 minutes, Amara had activated a hidden camera system she'd installed throughout the school as part of an independent study project on digital surveillance and student safety. The tiny wireless camera concealed in the restroom's ceiling vent had been broadcasting to Amara's laptop since the moment Piper entered the room. Now, as the confrontation escalated, Amara was live streaming the footage to an anonymous account she'd created specifically for documenting harassment at Northwood High School. "You see, Miss Blackwood," Hendricks said, advancing until he was less than 3 feet from Piper, "to mountain trash. Like you needs to learn that there are consequences for disrespecting your betters. Colton here tells me you deliberately targeted him in the hallway. Garrett says you threatened him in the cafeteria. That kind of aggressive behavior can't be tolerated. Both of those descriptions are lies," Piper said firmly, "but I'm guessing you already know that." "What I know," Hendricks replied, "is that you need an attitude adjustment. Boys, I think Miss Blackwood would benefit from some hands-on education about respect." Colton Ward stepped forward first, reaching out to grab Piper's arm. "This is for your own good," he said with a smirk. "We're just going to teach you some manners." That's when Piper's 8 years of Krav Maga training transformed her from cornered victim to lethal weapon. As Colton's hand reached for her arm, Piper grabbed his wrist with both hands, pivoted her hip, and executed a perfect arm drag that sent the wrestling captain flying into the ceramic sink. The impact created a sickening crack as his shoulder struck the porcelain edge, and he crumpled to the floor with a scream of pain that echoed off the tile walls. Marcus Briggs charged forward immediately, using his 200-pound frame to try to tackle Piper to the ground. She sidestepped at the last second, grabbed the back of his head, and drove her knee into his solar plexus with devastating precision. The technique, known as a knee strike to the body, was designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. But Marcus collapsed, gasping and unable to continue fighting. Garrett Stone, watching his teammates fall in less than 10 seconds, hesitated just long enough for Piper to take the initiative. She stepped toward him aggressively, feinted a punch to his face, and when he raised his hands to block, she drove her elbow into his ribs with enough force to crack bone. Garrett doubled over in pain, providing the perfect target for a hammer fist strike to the back of his neck that sent him to the floor unconscious. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds. Coach Hendricks stood frozen in shock, unable to process how a 16-year-old girl had just systematically destroyed 3 of his best wrestlers using techniques he'd never seen before. His years of intimidating students had never prepared him for facing someone who possessed both the skill and the willingness to fight back effectively. "What the hell are you?" he whispered, backing toward the locked door. "Someone who's tired of being bullied," Piper replied, advancing toward him with the fluid movement of a trained fighter. "And someone who's about to teach you what real consequences look like." Hendricks' shock transformed into rage as he realized his position of authority was being challenged by a student who clearly possessed skills that made his wrestlers look like amateurs. "You just assaulted 3 students," he shouted. "I'll have you arrested. You'll be expelled. Your mother will lose her job when I'm finished with you." "Let me explain something about assault," Piper said calmly, stopping just out of his reach. "Assault is what you did when you lured me here under false pretenses and used 4 males to intimidate 1 female. What I did was self-defense, and every second of it is being recorded by cameras you don't know about." Hendricks' face went pale as he processed the implications of her statement. "There are no cameras in here. I checked the surveillance system myself. The school's official cameras." "Sure," Piper agreed, "but students have access to technology you can't control. Right now, hundreds of people are watching a live stream of you threatening a teenage girl with physical violence." As if summoned by her words, Amara's voice echoed through Piper's phone speaker, which had been broadcasting the audio to the live stream. "Piper, we have 800 viewers and climbing. The police are on their way. Miss Kim is bringing security up the stairs right now." Hendricks lunged toward Piper in a desperate attempt to grab her phone and stop the broadcast. It was the worst mistake he could have made. Piper's response was immediate and devastating. As Hendricks charged forward, she grabbed his extended arm, stepped to the side, and used his momentum to throw him into the metal bathroom stall doors with a technique called redirecting force. The impact was tremendous, buckling the hinges and sending Hendricks crashing to the floor among his unconscious wrestlers. The restroom door burst open as Miss Kim arrived with 2 security officers and the school principal, Dr. Patricia Walsh. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything in Northwood High School's 90-year history. 3 wrestlers unconscious or groaning in pain. A powerful coach, sprawled among broken bathroom fixtures, and a slight teenage girl standing calmly in the center of the destruction. "What happened here?" Dr. Walsh demanded, her voice carrying the tone of someone whose career was about to be destroyed by the liability issues she was witnessing. "Coach Hendricks lured me here with a fake note," Piper replied, handing her phone to Miss Kim. "He and 3 wrestlers attempted to assault me. I defended myself. Everything is documented on video and was live-streamed to multiple platforms." Miss Kim looked at the phone screen, where comments were flooding in from viewers expressing shock and outrage at what they'd witnessed. The viewer count had reached over 1,500 people, including students, parents, teachers, and random internet users who discovered the stream through social media sharing. "Coach Hendricks," Dr. Walsh said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "you are suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the premises." "You can't do this to me," Hendricks shouted as he struggled to his feet. "I've built this program from nothing. That girl attacked my wrestlers. She's the one who should be arrested. The live stream shows you and 3 male students cornering a female student who defended herself." "Miss," Kim said firmly, "there are currently over 2,000 people watching this footage, including what appears to be several news organizations that have picked up the stream." Officer Martinez, one of the security guards, they was already calling for ambulances for the injured wrestlers and police backup to handle what was clearly going to become a major incident. "Ma'am," he said to Dr. Walsh, "we need to preserve this scene for criminal investigation. This goes way beyond school discipline." By 5 p.m., Northwood High School was surrounded by police cars, ambulances, and news vans. The live stream had gone viral on multiple platforms, with hashtags like #NorthwoodAbuse and #Krav Maga Girl trending locally and beginning to spread nationally. The footage showed clear evidence of adult-initiated violence against a minor, systematic harassment, and the kind of institutional abuse that civil rights organizations had been trying to expose for years. Amara Foster had become an overnight sensation in digital activism circles for her quick thinking in documenting and broadcasting the confrontation. Her decision to set up hidden cameras throughout the school as part of her independent study had created irrefutable evidence of systematic harassment that couldn't be denied or covered up by administrative spin. "Piper," Amara said as they sat in Miss Kim's office while lawyers and investigators conducted interviews, "you need to understand what's happening here. This isn't just about you and Hendricks anymore. This is about every student who's been afraid to speak up." Piper nodded, still processing the surreal experience of seeing herself on national news. The torn note from her locker hung in an evidence bag, while federal investigators reviewed the forged signature and compared it to examples of Hendricks' handwriting. Miss Blackwood, FBI Special Agent Sandra Lopez said as she entered the office, "We need to discuss the broader implications of today's incident. Our preliminary investigation suggests this represents a pattern of civil rights violations that may extend back several years." "What does that mean for the other students who were targeted?" Piper asked. "It means they'll finally have a chance to tell their stories without fear of retaliation." Agent Lopez replied, "Your decision to fight back and document everything has opened the door for accountability that these victims never thought possible." By 7 p.m., Coach Ryan Hendricks had been arrested and charged with assault, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit violence, and federal civil rights violations. The three wrestlers faced similar charges as adults, despite their age. Due to the severity and premeditated nature of their actions, the arrest was broadcast live on local news stations, showing Hendricks in handcuffs being led away from the school where he'd wielded unchecked power for 6 years. His mugshot, released within hours, showed a man who looked significantly less imposing than the intimidating authority figure who'd terrorized students. Principal Doctor. Walsh announced her resignation that evening, acknowledging that the administration had failed to protect students from systematic abuse. "The events of today have revealed institutional failures that I take full responsibility for," she said in a statement read to reporters. "Northwood High School needs new leadership to rebuild trust with our community." The school board called an emergency meeting for Saturday morning, facing pressure from parents, civil rights organizations, and federal investigators who discovered evidence of complaints about Hendricks that had been dismissed or buried over the years. "How many other girls did this happen to?" demanded Sarah Chen, whose daughter had transferred from Northwood the previous year after what they'd been told were attitude problems. "How many students suffered in silence because we trusted the system to protect them?" The answer was devastating. Over the weekend, as news of Hendricks' arrest spread, 23 former Northwood students came forward with stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse that painted a picture of systematic civil rights violations spanning Hendricks' entire tenure at the school. Jessica Martinez, who'd graduated 2 years earlier, revealed that Hendricks had used wrestler enforcers to physically intimidate her after she'd complained about sexual harassment from team members. "They cornered me in the parking lot and told me that filing reports would make my life at school impossible," she testified to investigators. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid of what they'd do if I spoke up." Michael Torres, a former wrestler who'd quit the team after refusing to participate in hazing rituals, described a culture where violence and intimidation were normalized as character building. "Hendricks taught us that weakness deserved punishment and that anyone who complained was just making excuses for their own failures," he said. The federal investigation expanded rapidly as the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights announced a comprehensive review of Northwood High School's disciplinary policies, complaint procédure, and administrative accountability systems. By Monday morning, Northwood had been transformed from a typical high school into the center of a national conversation about institutional abuse, student rights, and the role of athletics in educational settings. News crews camped outside the school. While inside, students organized support groups for harassment victims and began implementing peer-to-peer reporting systems that bypassed traditional administrative channels. Piper found herself thrust into a role she'd never wanted as the reluctant face of a movement demanding accountability from educational institutions. College recruiters called offering full scholarships. Self-defense organizations invited her to speak at conferences, and civil rights lawyers competed to represent her in lawsuits against the district. "I just wanted to finish high school quietly," she told her mother, Sarah, as they sat in their small apartment watching news coverage of the federal investigation. "I never intended to become a symbol of anything. Sometimes the right thing creates consequences we don't expect," Sarah replied, her voice filled with pride and concern. "Your father would have been proud of how you stood up for yourself and other students." The trial of Coach Hendricks and his wrestlers began 6 months later, drawing national media attention as prosecutors presented evidence of systematic civil rights violations, conspiracy to commit assault, and abuse of authority. The live-stream footage became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, providing irrefutable documentation of premeditated violence against a minor. The defendants didn't just attack Piper Blackwood. Federal prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez told the jury during opening statements they attacked the fundamental principle that every student has the right to education without fear of violence or intimidation. Hendricks' defense team attempted to portray the incident as a misunderstanding that had escalated due to Piper's excessive response to what they characterized as attempted discipline. The strategy backfired spectacularly when the defense attorney suggested that Piper should have accepted correction gracefully rather than fighting back. "Are you seriously arguing that a teenage girl should submit to assault by 4 adult males?" Prosecutor Rodriguez asked during cross-examination. "That she should have allowed herself to be victimized to protect her attackers from consequences?" The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Coach Hendricks was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, while the 3 wrestlers received sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years, their futures destroyed by their decision to participate in systematic harassment. The civil lawsuit against the school district resulted in a $12 million settlement that funded comprehensive anti-harassment programs, independent oversight systems, and scholarships for students who'd been victims of institutional abuse. The settlement announcement triggered a cascade of changes that extended far beyond Northwood's boundaries. Within weeks, Oregon's state legislature had introduced comprehensive education reform bills inspired by what media dubbed the Blackwood case. Senator Maria Gonzalez, chair of the Education Committee, cited Piper's live-streamed confrontation during floor debates about mandatory reporting systems. "When a 16-year-old girl has to use martial arts to stop sexual predators in our schools, we failed as legislators, as educators, and as a society," Senator Gonzalez declared. The Blackwood Protection Act will ensure that no other student faces what Piper endured. The legislation required all Oregon schools to install comprehensive surveillance systems, implement anonymous reporting mechanisms, and establish independent oversight boards with authority to investigate harassment complaints without interference from local administrators. Piper found herself testifying before the state legislature 6 months after the restroom incident. Her calm demeanor and factual presentation creating powerful television moments that influenced lawmakers across party lines. Conservative legislators who typically opposed education spending found themselves supporting increased funding for student protection programs after hearing her testimony. I'm not here asking for sympathy or special treatment. Piper told the packed legislative chamber, I'm here because systematic institutional abuse thrives in darkness, and transparency is the only sustainable solution. Every student deserves to feel safe at school, regardless of their economic background, family connections, or athletic abilities. The hearing was broadcast live on C-SPAN and later featured in a Netflix documentary series about student activism that won multiple Emmy Awards. Piper's articulate presentation and evident sincerity created a compelling narrative that resonated with viewers nationwide, transforming her from a local news story into a national symbol of student empowerment. The documentary's success led to speaking engagements at universities across the country, where Piper addressed audiences of education professionals, student activists, and civil rights advocates. Her standard presentation included the live stream footage from the Restroom confrontation, though she always prefaced it with warnings about the graphic nature of the violence and her hope that technology could prevent such incidents rather than just document them. People often ask me if I regret fighting back. She would tell audiences, but I've learned that the real question isn't whether I should have defended myself. The real question is why 4 grown men thought they could corner a teenage girl in a bathroom and face no consequences. The problem wasn't my response to abuse. The problem was the culture that enabled abuse in the first place. Her speeches were recorded and shared widely on social media, inspiring student activists at hundreds of schools to organize their own anti-harassment campaigns. The Blackwood Protocol system of hidden cameras, anonymous reporting, and peer support networks was implemented by student groups nationwide, often without official administrative approval. At Roosevelt High School in Seattle, student journalist Maya Patel used Piper's strategies to expose systematic grade manipulation that favored athletes. At Jefferson Middle School in Atlanta, 8th grader Marcus Williams documented racist harassment from teachers that resulted in federal civil rights charges. At Lincoln High in Phoenix, sophomore Jessica Reyes live-streamed a confrontation with a counselor who'd been pressuring female students to accept guidance that involved inappropriate physical contact. Each case referenced Piper's example, citing her courage and tactical use of technology as inspiration for their own activism. Civil rights organizations began tracking what they called Blackwood Casas incidents, where students used digital documentation and social media to expose institutional abuse that traditional reporting systems had ignored or covered up. The phenomenon caught the attention of researchers at Harvard's Education Policy Institute, who conducted a comprehensive study of harassment reporting before and after the Northwood incident. Their findings revealed a 300% increase in successful harassment complaints at schools nationwide, along with significant reductions in repeat offenses by administrators and teachers. The Blackwood effect demonstrates how individual courage can create systemic change when combined with technological tools and community support, noted Dr. Patricia Chung, the study's lead researcher. Students who might have suffered in silence found voice and agency through her example. The research also documented concerning backlash effects in some districts, where administrators implemented policies designed to prevent student recording rather than address underlying harassment issues. These anti-Blackwood policies became targets for civil rights lawsuits, with courts consistently ruling that students' rights to document abuse outweighed institutional interests in avoiding accountability. Piper's mother, Sarah, watched her daughter's transformation from shy transfer student to national advocate with mixed emotions. The speaking engagements and media attention provided financial stability their family had never experienced, but she worried about the psychological toll of repeatedly reliving traumatic experiences for public audiences. Sometimes I wonder if we should have just moved to another district after the first incident with Hendricks, Sarah confided to Miss Kim during one of their regular check-ins. Piper's handling everything well, but she's still just a teenager dealing with adult responsibilities. Miss Kim who had become something of a celebrity herself as the counselor who'd supported Piper throughout the crisis, understood Sarah's concerns. "Your daughter chose to transform her trauma into advocacy that's protecting thousands of other students," she replied. "That's not a burden we can take away from her, but we can make sure she has support systems to handle it." The support came from unexpected sources. Master Samuel Cohn, Piper's original Krav Maga instructor, traveled from Montana to Oregon several times to provide continuing training and emotional counseling. His perspective as a former military professional who'd transitioned to teaching young people gave him unique insight into helping Piper process the psychological aftermath of violence. "Physical skills are just tools," Cohen reminded Piper during one of their sessions. "The real strength you've shown is in choosing when and how to use those tools for protection rather than aggression. You've honored everything I taught you about defending others, not just yourself." The validation from her mentor meant more to Piper than any media recognition or legislative testimony. It confirmed that her split-second decision in the restroom had been consistent with years of training about using strength responsibly and protecting vulnerable people from those who would abuse power. More importantly, Northwood High School was transformed from an institution that protected predators into a model for student safety and administrative accountability. The reforms implemented after Hendricks' conviction were studied by education researchers and adopted by school districts nationwide. Piper Sterling graduated from Northwood as valedictorian 2 years later, having earned a full scholarship to Stanford University, where she planned to study civil rights law. Her graduation speech focused on the relationship between individual courage and institutional change. "2 years ago, I thought surviving high school meant staying invisible and avoiding trouble," she told her graduating class. "But sometimes avoiding trouble means allowing injustice to continue. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing." The speech was recorded and shared widely on social media, inspiring new generations of students to recognize their power to challenge institutional abuse and create safer educational environments. Coach Ryan Hendricks remained in federal prison, where he would serve the remainder of his sentence as a registered predator whose case had become a landmark example of how technology could expose institutional abuse that had previously operated with impunity. Amara Foster graduated a year after Piper and received a full scholarship to MIT, where she continued developing technology solutions for documenting and preventing institutional harassment. Her hidden camera system became the foundation for a nonprofit organization that helps students create accountability in schools where traditional reporting systems failed. Northwood High School became a pilgrimage site for educators, civil rights advocates, and student activists who wanted to understand how meaningful institutional reform was possible when communities demanded accountability and students found courage to challenge abuse. Most importantly, hundreds of students who attended Northwood during and after Hendricks' removal completed their education without experiencing the harassment and intimidation that had characterized the school's culture for years. The third-floor girls' restroom where the confrontation occurred was converted into a peace and meditation space, with a plaque reading, "In honor of students who find courage to speak truth to power and create safer communities for everyone." The restroom incident had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact protected students for generations to come. Piper's decision to fight back had transformed from personal self-defense into a catalyst for changing how American schools address institutional abuse. In the end, the shy girl who just wanted to complete high school quietly had become a catalyst for transforming educational approaches to harassment and violence. Every time a student found courage to report abuse, every time an administrator prioritized student safety over institutional reputation, and every time a predator faced real consequences for exploiting their authority, Piper Blackwood's moment of courage echoed through another school, making education safer for everyone. The lesson was profound but simple. Sometimes, the smallest person in the room possesses the strength to create the biggest change. especially when that strength is combined with courage, technology, and community support willing to demand justice. Hendrix's career was over, but Piper's impact on American education had just begun.